Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. So, it was almost 4 years ago to the day that I responded to this bullshit.
Hello everybody, I thought it was really important that I filmed some sort of response to the Santa Barbara shooting, which happened yesterday, in which a 22-year-old man, who was also a men's rights activist, went out on the streets of Santa Barbara and decided to kill and wound other young women.
And 4 years later, and probably hundreds and hundreds of articles with misleading and false information later, I'm still dealing with it.
There is, without a doubt, a bleed over between incel communities, the men's rights movements, and factions of the alt-right. Today's white supremacists, if they call themselves, to be part of the alt-right, are misogynistic in a way that white supremacists just a few years ago were not. It used to be the case that neo-Nazis and those kinds of really extreme anti-Semites and racists put women on a pedestal. Members of today's white supremacist movement are total misogynists.
We have a serious phenomenon among Western women where once they reach the age of perhaps 28 or 30, they begin to develop serious psychological illness.
There's a lot of examples of alt-right leaders who started with hating women and then eventually came to hate Jews, black people, and so on and so forth. It's all sort of been brought together, and these movements are bolstering each other, right? People will work across them. Be a white supremacist and an incel and a men's rights activist. That's what we're seeing going on right now.
Really? Is that a fact? Can you name a single person who is a men's rights activist, an incel, and a member of the alt-right? Just one single person. Can you name one single person who's an incel and an MRA? So the shit you just saw there was from the Southern Poverty Law Center. And they recently declared that Elliot Rodger was the first alt-right spree killer, despite the fact that he was half Asian and he died before the term alt-right was ever used. Yeah, and look, to my knowledge, he never expressed any political opinion. I have no idea if he was right-wing or left-wing. Most likely, he didn't give a shit about politics because he was too concerned about not sleeping with blonde women. So I'm not exactly sure how he's a member of the alt-right, except, of course, that the SPLC and others like them just like to lump anyone they disagree with into the same group, right? They're all mashed together. Once again, in their own words, there's a huge crossover between incels, MRAs, and the alt-right, apparently. Not that there's ever any evidence given to support this. So, in the same article in which they claim that Elliot Rodger was the first alt-right killer, they have this to say. The grievances collected by those motivated by white nationalist ideology at the heart of the alt-right often do not begin with racist propaganda, but rather in the toxic communities of the men's rights movement. Really? Yeah, I'm guessing there'll be no evidence to back this up, of course. While driven by distinct ideologies. So you admit that they're different, okay. The style of grievance nursed by the men's rights and white nationalist communities are similarly constructed around a privileged group threatened by the visible social mobility of those that were formerly oppressed, women and minorities respectively. So in other words, they're two different groups with distinct ideologies, using the exact words here, but because they don't subscribe to their specific brand of social justice where only certain people are allowed to have issues, that means they're pretty much the same thing. In other words, you're not allowed to say that men have issues too, because there's an oppressed group and there's an oppressor group. And only the oppressed group are allowed to have issues. The oppressors are not allowed to have issues because they're the bad guys. And, we can't have any sympathy for the bad guys. And apparently that makes all of us white supremacists, alt-right Trump supporters or some shit. Yeah. Some pretty damning evidence right there. I don't know why people think the SPLC has become a joke, right? It makes you wonder why the FBI stopped using them as a source. I mean, who knows? It must be the patriarchy behind that. So, last episode I looked at the overlap fallacy, which is often used by feminists and social justice advocates and is being used by the SPLC right here. And following the van attack in Toronto, it was used extensively in the media. So let's have a look at some of those articles. I'm not going to go through the entire articles, but concentrate on the sections mentioning men's rights, because I want to focus on that particular aspect of the story. So let's start with the Daily Beast. An article called "Accused Toronto Killer Praised Women-Hating Mass Murderer Moments Before Attack." And it says in the first paragraph, "The man accused of mowing down pedestrians in a bloody rampage in Toronto on Monday expressed his support moments before the attack for a mass murderer who became a hero of the fringe men's rights movement." Really? Elliot Rodger became the hero of the men's rights movement? Yeah, that's strange, because we've never supported him. All we've ever fucking said was he wasn't a fucking MRA. So the lie started that Elliot Rodger was subscribed to men's rights channels on YouTube, which was a lie, and that then spread from the Daily Kos over to Mike.com, where it became he visited men's rights websites, so subscribe to YouTube channels became websites, and then that became supported by men's rights activists, as well as influenced by men's rights activists, all of which are lies, and there has been no evidence put forward at any point. Now, yes, it is true there are some incels who do support Elliot Rodger, but incels are not men's rights activists. Okay, not getting laid is not advocating for the human rights of men. It's amazing that I have to try to explain that to people. Later in the article, she says, Elliot Rodger killed 6 people during the 2014 shooting spree in Isla Vista, California. The 22-year-old called himself an incel, or an involuntary celibate, a phrase invoked by men's rights activists who feel rejected by women. Yeah, except we don't use that phrase, do we? We're talking about 2 separate groups, which are only connected in the minds of dishonest feminist journalists. And then we have an article in the Jewish Voice. Toronto Madman in van attack is men's rights activist. So now it's gone from him posting a comment about someone who is falsely identified as a men's rights activist to him actually being a men's rights activist. So I'm wondering, what men's human rights did this guy advocate for? The answer is none. It says, Canadian media has reported that the suspect accused of killing 10 pedestrians, which he ploughed to death with his van, was once in the military but quit and was quite possibly a men's rights activist. So quite possibly can be interpreted as absolutely no evidence, but we're just going to make it up anyway. It goes on to say, details regarding the suspect's motives are sketchy, but authorities figured out via social media that he was involved in men's rights activism. Well, that's a straight-out lie, isn't it? There is nothing in his social media that would suggest that he's involved in men's rights activism in any fucking way. He commented about Elliot Rodger, who was not a men's rights activist. That's it. It goes on to say, the term incels refers to a group of men's rights activists, once again wrong, who are involuntary celibate and who commiserate together about their lack of sexual activity. The Facebook post also praised Elliot Rodger, a self-confessed virgin who shot and killed 6 people and injured 14 others near the campus of University of California, Santa Barbara, 2014. Then from The Verge, we have an article called "The Internet is Enabling a Community of Men Who Want to Kill Women. They Need to be Stopped." Yes, nothing like a little bit of fear-mongering, right? It goes on to say, in the stories of angry men's rights activists and incels, okay, so they falsely put the two together, men who are involuntary celibate and denied their right to sex, the women of the world are in control, teasing and taunting and withholding, even as men maintain incredible majorities and nearly half of power. Yeah, but those men are put in power by voters, right? So let me get this straight, because most politicians around the world are men, we can't talk about men's issues. So the best thing to do, I guess, if you're a dishonest journalist from The Verge, is just to strawman the men's rights movement into a group of men who think that they are denied the right to have sex, right? Because that's a legitimate human rights issue that we talk about, you lying fucking cunts. And then from the Right Scoop, Toronto van attack terrorist is an extremist men's rights weirdo. Yeah, really. And they quote from an article from The Hill, so let's have a look at that. Toronto rampage suspect referenced extremist male incel movement. The suspect in Monday's Toronto van attack referenced an extremist men's rights movement. Really, did he? Have you got a copy of that? Can you show us exactly what he said about the men's rights movement? Because I don't think you can somehow. It goes on to say, and praised a 22-year-old mass shooter in the Facebook post made before the attack. Yes, a 22-year-old mass shooter who had no connection to the men's rights movement whatsoever. But, you know, don't mention that part, will you? And then from CNN, the Toronto van suspect apparently lauded an American mass killer. The article goes on to talk about Elliot Rodger and says, investigators noted that Rodger was motivated by a personal grievance related to the extremist ideological subculture of men's rights activism. Really? Well, it's been 4 years, and none of you dishonest fucking assholes have ever put forward the slightest piece of evidence to support that. And from USA Today, Incels, Alek Minassian and the dangerous idea of being owed sex. So jumping down to the bit about men's rights, where this merges with broader far-right, and particularly the alt-right and the white nationalist communities, is we see a lot of people pass through this men's rights community. Really? Could you name them? A lot of people? Should be a big list. Can you give us a lot of names? I don't think you can, really. Or at least engaging with this type of material and ideas. In other words, any idea which is not part of the social justice agenda is all the same. They're all the same group. They're all not us. They're all evil outsiders. Before they go on to participate in other forms of bigotry. Hanks said SPLC considers incels a subsection of the men's rights movement, which claims that men are discriminated against, often using anti-women rhetoric. Well, apparently the SPLC thinks men aren't discriminated against in any way. It goes on to talk to Michael Kimmel, Michael Kimmel, founder and director of the Center of the Study of Men and Masculinities at Stony Brook University and author of Angry White Men, Masculinity at the End of an Era, says those in the men's rights movement believe feminism has given women more freedom at the expense of men. No, not really. I mean, if you look at someone like Warren Farrell, he says that women now have more choices and men should also have those choices. It should be okay for men to stay at home and be stay-at-home dads instead of the expectation that they should be earner providers and that's their only role. I would think that Kimmel would agree with something like that, but, that would mean that admitting that MRAs are correct about something, wouldn't it? He writes, they may not feel powerful, but they do feel entitled to feel powerful. And it's this aggrieved entitlement that animates the men's rights movement, really. Isn't it interesting that all these media outlets talk to all these so-called experts, and all these experts are social justice, anti-MRA hate mongers, but to my knowledge not one of them actually reached out and spoke to an actual men's rights activist and asked their opinion as to what they thought of this whole mess. I suspect they might have got a very, very different answer than they were expecting.
Look, I guess the first thing to do is to get the biggest lie they told out of the way. No investigator ever said that Rodger was motivated to carry out his attack by a personal grievance related to his immersion in the extremist ideological subculture of men's rights activists. The trio of fake news manufacturers on the confabulated news network just lied about it. Elliot Rodger wasn't subbed to any MRA or MGTOW YouTube channels. There is no evidence he participated in or even visited any of our forums ever. Rodger was an incel or involuntary celibate. That means he was rejected sexually by women and construed that to mean he was a victim of some sort or another. From what we know, he spent time at the now-defunct PUAHate.com before going on his killing spree, all of which is to say that Rodger was not even remotely connected to MRAs. He was, like many of the other killers, on the autism spectrum and suffered from father absence, but I don't think CNN wants me to make too big a deal about that. They don't want actual facts to cloud their narrative that there is a connection between advocating for men and mass murder. And they're not the only ones. The porcine, mendacious, and intellectually flatulent David Futrell, writing for the fashion and beauty rag Elle, goes even further in painting the false picture. In his article, linked, he writes, and I quote, "The basic proposition, at once chilling and faintly ludicrous, might as well be the motto of the Incel movement as a whole. Incels are an offshoot of the larger male supremacy movement whose penchant for wildly misogynistic speech and violent actions landed them on the Southern Poverty Law Center's list of official hate groups this year." Unquote. I'll give Futrell credit for one thing. As far as efficient writing goes, he can pack more lies per paragraph than most seasoned propagandists. Incels are not an offshoot of the men's rights movement, which, by the way, is not a male supremacy movement. But since I can't possibly cover all of Futrell's mendacious claims, I'll just stick with the connection between incels and MRAs he fabricated.
That's why they don't ask MRAs, because we would actually tell the truth and expose their lies. I get it. Now, the job of journalists should be to tell the truth, right? They should present the facts and just the facts as best they possibly can. But what we find whenever there is a shooting or a mass murder or whatever is these journalists, these feminist journalists with an ideological starting point, will scour through social media trying to find any connection they can between the killer and anyone who disagrees with their politics. The Elliot Rodger case was the perfect example of this, where the journalist from the Daily Kos scoured through YouTube and mistakenly thought that Rodger was subscribed to MRA channels when in fact he wasn't. Rodger was, however, subscribed to the Young Turks. I never hear that brought up. So maybe we can start claiming he was a progressive. But this is done to produce propaganda. It's done to produce bias information which creates a stereotype that anyone who disagrees with their particular point of view is dangerous. Clearly, Elliot Rodger and Minassian and all these others were influenced by the evil men's rights movement, which in turn has a massive crossover with the alt-right because all these groups are exactly the same, etc., etc., etc. This is not journalism. This is propaganda. These people are propagandists. That's it. Now the thing is, politics is a spectrum. We know that social justice warriors know what a spectrum is because they tell us all the time that gender is on a spectrum, but apparently they don't feel the same way about politics. Instead of there being a spectrum between far left and far right, they see it as the far left and everything else is the far right. It's that simple. If you aren't in their small little bubble of people who believe exactly what they believe, then you are an evil right-wing, alt-right, white supremacist, MRA, Incel, Trump-voting, neo-Nazi, Hitler supporter, etc., etc., etc. And this is the type of shit we see over and over and over again in the media. So anyway, let's have a look at another article, and this one I want to go through with a little bit more detail than those others. So the article is from the Washington Post, and it's by Aditi Natasha Keeney, and it's called Feminists Were Right, Ignoring Online Misogyny Has Deadly Consequences. So I'll jump down to the bit where she starts talking about MRAs. She says,
Feminists have been warning the world about incels and men's rights activists for a while.
Ah, yes, warning the world about the evil MRAs. And what she means by that is spreading lies, misinformation, and propaganda at every possible opportunity. Yeah, I don't know why MRAs don't like feminists. It's a bit of a mystery. Maybe one day we'll find the answer to. I don't know. Next.
The Southern Poverty Law Center recently added the extremism of male supremacy to the ideologies it tracks.
Yes, and wasn't that a joke? They basically claimed that Return of Kings and A Voice for Men are male supremacy websites. Now, the interesting thing about this is they never track any radical feminist websites, or even mainstream feminist websites, which are constantly filled with hate. Those are never classed as female supremacy websites. For some reason, they're out of bounds. I mean, I'm sure I can find many radical feminist websites saying horrific things about trans people. Surely the Southern Poverty Law Center wouldn't support them, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure the Southern Poverty Law Center would be supporting trans rights. I'm pretty sure they're not transphobic. So why aren't they criticizing the radical feminists? Why aren't they calling them a female supremacy movement? Because that goes against their ideology, doesn't it? I mean, radical feminists are out of bounds simply because they're female. Yeah, no sexism there. Next.
Noting that it is fundamental to the racist alt-right, and in many ways served as its gateway drug.
The bullshit gateway drug argument again, which is based on the premise that if you're not supporting the special groups, those who are classed as oppressed, then you must be supporting the oppressor. Therefore, anyone who supports the rights of men is supporting oppressors, just like anyone who supports the rights of whites. or is a white supremacist. In their minds, there's no difference because only certain people have issues and only certain people can be supported. How very progressive. Next.
When I wrote in November about how such groups can indoctrinate misogyny, I was doxxed, that is, my public information was shared on the internet and harassed, perhaps ironically proving my point.
Now, I should point out that doxing is wrong, and anyone who doxes someone else is a scumbag. You should be attacking the argument and not the person. But I could very easily also point out that it's not just MRAs or anti-feminists or alt-righters or whoever who dox people. It's also people on the left and the far left. In fact, feminist Lacey Green was doxed because she used the word tranny. And there are many people in Gamergate who were doxed by people on the left. So it's not something exclusively done by the evil right-wing, Trump-supporting, MRA, pro-Nazi white supremacists who obviously only do it to women. But instead it's something done by a small percentage of people in numerous groups across the political spectrum. And once again, for the record, it's wrong whether you're right-wing or left-wing or MRA or feminist or whatever. Or if you don't use any labels, it doesn't really matter. Doxing is wrong. Stick to the fucking arguments. Attack the arguments and not the person making the argument, in other words. That's a lesson the left could really learn. But anyway, let's continue.
The red pill and other pickup artist forums treat women as objects in a predatory game. Men's rights activists who decry feminism do not actually face any oppression from those women.
Yeah, we don't claim to be oppressed, okay? We claim that men have issues. I'm sick and tired of repeating this, but saying that men have issues too does not mean that men are oppressed and women are the oppressors. Okay, so this is the way that feminists see the world. It's like a seesaw. And you have one group which is at the top and one group at the bottom. And if you say that the group supposedly at the top has some kind of issues, then you must be flipping the seesaw. So you're saying that the other group is now oppressing them or some shit. That's not an accurate representation of the world. It's a lot more complex than that. It's not simplistic and black and white with one group oppressing the other. Now, it's impossible for feminists to understand this because their very worldview is based on this. It is the cornerstone of their worldview. If you pull this one cornerstone out, their whole house of cards falls down. Next.
Even though one former Google employee thought diversity was special treatment, and no matter that his followers think his subsequent dismissal over a memo he wrote was a violation of his free speech rights. MRA groups function on an idea of essential biological differences that dehumanize women.
No, we do not think that essential biological differences dehumanize women. Yes, there are biological differences between men and women. That's pretty obvious. I mean, that's why we have men and women competing in different events in the Olympics, right? But, you know, we don't use that to say that women are less human or should be denied opportunities or anything like that. Next.
The Google engineer thought women were biologically unsuited for his chosen work.
No, he didn't think that women were biologically unsuited for his chosen work. He said that there are reasons why less women choose to do that particular type of work. That doesn't mean that the women who choose to do it are less suited or incapable of doing it. It's all about choice. Because women choose to do certain things and men typically choose to do other certain things doesn't make one group superior to the other biologically. That's nonsense. Next.
While incels think women, often called femoids, are biologically wired only to have sex with mainstream men they refer to as chads.
Well, I do think it's a little bit more complex than that. If we're going to talk about it in simplistic terms, though, then yes, both men and women have certain choices when it comes to a partner. They typically prefer certain looks or certain types over other certain types, and in some cases there is a biological reason for this. Next.
They think that they themselves are biologically destined for celibacy. Men's rights activism is a reaction to feminism, not in support of equality but a tactical move to undermine women's rights.
So, how exactly is talking about high male suicide rates and the sentencing gap and bodily integrity rights and parental rights and male homelessness and those other men's rights issues, how is that undermining women's rights? You're basically saying the only reason any group of people would talk about those things is to attack women, as opposed to actually deal with those issues. That's a pretty scummy fucking thing to say, in my opinion. But, you know, I really shouldn't be surprised. It's the type of shit I hear all the time. Next.
Because other gender minorities including trans and non-binary people would confound this issue, incels entirely leave out queer people, saying that they have easier access to sex. In order for their claim of victimhood to work, sex has to be a binary, otherwise, it would be exceedingly clear that these men aren't advocating for their own rights but rather actively working against other people having equal rights.
Okay, first of all, incels aren't advocating for rights. Okay, complaining on the internet that they aren't getting laid or aren't getting female attention or affection or validation is not advocating for human rights. So let's get that clear. Secondly, though, incels are straight men. So I'm not exactly sure why they would be concerned about trans or non-binary people when they're straight. Like, they're complaining that they aren't getting attention from women. So I'm a bit confused as to why you think they should be talking about trans or non-binary people. I guess what you're trying to say is that if they're not exclusively talking about a so-called marginalized group, then they must be bigots. I think that's what you mean, but who can be sure with the word salad that I just read? Next.
I like to call this protagonist anxiety, a generalized, violent fear that you may not be the only main character in the narrative.
So in other words, if they're not talking about a marginalized group, then they're selfish, oppressive pricks who are just interested in themselves. So they can't actually talk about their own issues, I guess, unless they identify as queer or trans or something. In which case it would be perfectly fine for them to talk about their issues. I think that's the rules or something. Next.
On the surface, MRA groups seem innocuous, almost progressive, support groups for men. Men and everyone else should be able to find community to talk about their inability to find partners.
Okay, so here we see her combining MRAs and incels again. She starts by saying that, you know, on the surface MRA groups seem almost progressive. And then she starts talking about communities where they supposedly we talk about our inability to find partners. Yeah, they're not MRA groups, they're incel groups, for fuck's sake. So what she's doing is combining incels and MRAs together, and then she's transforming actual men's rights topics into the inability to find a partner to strawman MRAs in general, right? Because it's much easier to stereotype and strawman all MRAs as angry, lonely guys who just can't get laid, rather than talking about actual MRA topics and issues. Next.
Silencing that would only contribute to toxic masculinity. But the foundation that these groups are based on is flawed. Men, as a group, are not oppressed.
Once again, MRAs are not claiming that we're fucking oppressed. If you don't understand what we're talking about, you shouldn't have a job writing these fucking articles. But unfortunately, these journalists can only see the world through their feminist lens. They are incapable of understanding anything which is not seen through that lens. Next.
Incels act as if women choosing not to have sex with them is systemic persecution, but of course it isn't. Their groups find common ground over a shared sense of entitlement to women's bodies.
Okay, so first of all, she's going back and forth between men's rights and incels as if there's no difference. So fucking typical, I'm sick of it. And then she, of course, claims that incels have a sense of entitlement to women's bodies. Okay, that's the most simplistic way of looking at incels. As I've said repeatedly, I think it's a lot more complex than that. I think these guys want some kind of validation and understanding and attention from women. They want to feel loved and cared for, like normal human beings do. But instead they feel rejected. They're seen as outcasts. And I don't think that's a healthy attitude. And I think blaming all women is not the solution. I think that just makes things worse. But the other thing which isn't the solution is demonizing them as monsters who think that it's okay to rape women and go on shooting sprees at a drop of a hat. That's not helping these guys. That's pushing more of them to the extreme. You're actually making it more likely that more of them will pick up guns and go and do this, or drive vans over innocent people. We should be encouraging these guys to have a more positive outlook on life, not pushing them further away. Next.
By dehumanizing women, incels create an echo chamber where their casual misogyny can be amplified. Ironically, the term word was coined by a woman who was trying to understand loneliness.
Ironically, the term word was coined by a woman who was trying to understand loneliness. Yeah, and that's what these guys are going through. Extreme loneliness. And that loneliness turns to anger. It's not about sex, or just sex. I'm sure there's one or two who would be okay with just getting sex, but I think for most of them it's a lot more complex than that. And essentially you're accusing them of dehumanizing women, but what you're doing is dehumanizing them as men. You're ignoring all the natural need that human beings have for affection and validation and attention and understanding and human touch, and you're reducing them down to horny, angry men who just want to fuck. That, in my book, is dehumanizing. Now, do incels deserve criticism? Yes, of course they do. Blaming all women is not the solution, as I've said numerous times. But dehumanizing incels isn't the solution either. Next.
Censoring incel and other manosphere groups is tricky territory. People have the right to free speech and free association. Free speech on the internet is a much championed cause. But we need to examine the power dynamics of said freedoms, and the effects of speech. The more privileged you are, the more protected you are. We need to broaden our definition of hate speech, examine the radicalization effects of unfettered free speech, and examine the role of the internet in fostering violent ideation.
Oh, I get it. So everyone should have free speech, but the so-called privileged group should have less free speech. Is that right? Is that what you're saying? Yeah, that seems fair. And who decides who's privileged and not, I wonder? Oh, it's the people who don't get any restrictions on their free speech. What a coincidence. Yeah, I can't see any problem with that. Now, obviously, there is such a thing as hate speech, and there is a certain type of hate speech which probably should be banned, right? And so let me give you an example. If someone were to jump on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, and they were to incite people to form a mob and go down to their local synagogue and burn it to the ground and shoot all the Jews inside, yes, that should be banned. There should be consequences to that. The police should be knocking on their door and asking what the fuck's going on. That's inciting violence. However, teaching your pug to do a Nazi salute is not hate speech. And that should not be banned. Even if you find it distasteful, even if you don't like it, it should not be banned. But let's have an actual look at the definition of hate speech. Now, to be fair, it may vary from country to country, but generally speaking, hate speech is speech that attacks a person or group on the basis of attributes such as race, religion, ethnic origin, national origin, gender, disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Now that's interesting. I think a great many feminist articles on the internet fall under the definition of hate speech. So, attacks on a person or group on the basis of attributes such as race. So, if you're saying that all white people XYZ, that is technically hate speech. It's got ethnic origin and national origin. So, if you're criticizing Western culture or Americans or whatever, once again, technically that's hate speech. Gender. Wow. So I guess all those articles criticizing masculinity and men, calling masculinity toxic, I guess technically that's hate speech, isn't it? Sexual orientation. So all those articles criticizing heterosexuals, the whole heterosexual normative stuff, I guess that's hate speech too. Oh, but hold on. That doesn't apply to certain groups, does it? So when social justice advocates come out with this stuff, well, that's freedom of speech. They're just expressing an opinion. They're talking about topics that need to be discussed. But when people outside their bubble discuss these things, well, that's hate speech. And the only reason they're doing it is out of hate, not because they want an actual conversation about certain things. What a fucking load of bullshit. Now, free speech isn't free. That might sound like a contradiction there, but it's not. There is a consequence to free speech, and that is that if you have the right to say things that other people may find offensive, then in turn you may have to hear things that other people say that you find offensive. You can't have it one way. It has to be a two-way street or it doesn't work. If it's not a two-way street, it is not free speech. And trust me, I hear things every day which I find offensive. I go through these articles and videos all the fucking time, and they're fucking offensive. They refer to men's rights activists as pro-rape and pedophiles, and they claim that we hate women and we hate trans people and black people and all this other fucking hate-filled bullshit. And it's all lies, and it's all done to create a false narrative and propaganda. So if you want to take away my right to criticize feminism, then you also endanger your right to say those things about us. That's the way a free and equal society has to work. You can't give free speech to certain groups and allow them to say whatever they want while restricting others. That is not free fucking speech. Next.
Look at what happens when the far right finds itself confronted by speech it doesn't like. A Nazi group burns swastikas outside of a small Georgia town that dared to take a stand against their rally. Conservatives launch an online attack to rob a professor of livelihood and reputation for saying she didn't care about Barbara Bush's death. Women are banned from Facebook for saying men are trash.
And you know what? I agree. The right wing also tries to censor people. I'm not in any way fucking supporting the right wing when they do that, but unfortunately this journalist is going to ignore the fact that the left does it as well, in particular the far left. This is something which becomes much more common the further away from the centre you get. It doesn't matter if you go to the left or the right. the further away from the centre you get, the more likely you are to get people trying to shut down opinions which disagree with theirs. That's one of the reasons why I like staying right in the centre. So, yeah, by all means, call out the right-wingers who try to censor speech they don't like. But don't be a hypocrite and acknowledge that the left are doing exactly the same thing. Speaking of which, let's have a look at that last bit you just said. Women are banned from Facebook for saying men are trash. Yeah, and do you know why that happened? That happened because there are numerous feminist groups out there claiming that speech should be controlled in public spaces. All right, for years now they've been preaching that public spaces have to be safe and that you can't say anything which is going to offend someone. Now, unfortunately for them, they were of the opinion that these rules should only apply to other people and not themselves. But it's, I guess it's a case of feminism backfiring, isn't it? Because those very people who insisted that we should have these rules are now being victimised by these rules. Actually, is victimised the right term? Are you a victim if you shoot yourself in the foot? I'm not sure. Next.
A young man is radicalized into hatred that knows no aim, a hatred for a mainstream culture that seemingly rejected him and denied him sexual access.
Yeah, I think it's more to do with the rejection rather than the sexual access. Now, the feminists in the media seem to be talking about the sexual part of it. The fact that Elliot, Rodger and Minassian were angry that they didn't have access to female bodies because they saw females as nothing but objects, etc., etc. It's interesting how so few of them, though, talk about Minassian having mental health issues and being bullied.
Minassian went to Thornley High School, just north of Toronto. Several former classmates have told CBC News he had mental health issues and was bullied.
But instead of that, which I think a normal person would admit is somewhat relevant to the story, we get this bullshit.
Experience violence.
Police won't comment on motive, but this women's advocate says even a possibility of a link to misogyny needs to be acknowledged.
We're looking away from the issue and wanting to blame the internet, wanting to blame mental health, wanting to blame religion, race, etc. But if you look at the common factor here, it's often, way too often, a real rage and a misogyny.
Ah, yes, of course, because misogyny is to blame for everything. Now, many of you may not know this, but last year, just before Christmas, there was a very similar attack in my home city of Melbourne.
Now to a terrifying attack in the heart of Melbourne, Australia. Police say a driver deliberately rammed his speeding vehicle into a crowd of Christmas shoppers at a busy intersection. The 32-year-old suspect was taken into custody after resisting arrest by an off-duty police officer. 18 people were injured in the attack, including a small child, and one witness describes the horror of what he saw.
Hear this big, sounded like an explosion, screaming. I sprinted down seconds after the crash, and it's just bodies just everywhere.
Did you see the driver?
No, I just saw the SUV that was like the front of it was like a crushed tin can.
It's certainly horrifying witness account there. Sarah James is in Melbourne. We understand this man is in custody. There's video of it. Who is he, and is there a terror link?
First of all, there is no terror link. That's what authorities here in Melbourne said tonight at a press conference about 9:30 local time, about 5 hours after it all unfolded this afternoon at the height of the shopping season. As to the identity of the suspect, he is a 32-year-old Australian citizen of Afghan descent, and he has a history, the authorities tell us tonight, of mental health issues, drug problems, and there have been some altercations in the past Nothing, however, like what happened tonight, and they made a point of saying he was not out on bail. What happened was that he drove his SUV straight up the middle of a very busy street between the main train station and the busy shopping center. Pedestrians who were crossing between those two locations did not have a chance, and he mowed into the crowd, injuring 18 people. 4 of them are in critical condition in local area hospitals, including 1 child. So there are a lot of families who are in terrible shock tonight here in Melbourne local time. Now, authorities, as I say, what happened was that there was an off-duty police officer, and at the end of that barreling through the crowd, the SUV hit part of a tram stop. And this quick-thinking off-duty police officer reached into the driver's side of the car, pulled out the suspect, wrestled with him. He, the off-duty police officer, also sustained some injuries, and he is also in the hospital this evening.
So these are 2 very similar incidents. They both involved men with a history of mental illness using a vehicle to mow down as many pedestrians as they could in the hope of injuring or killing them. Now, Minassian was connected to the Incel movement, and the attacker in Melbourne has been connected to Islam. In fact, he said that the reason why he did it was a perceived mistreatment of Muslims. That's a direct quote from the person who did this. And the detective who interviewed him said there was something to do with Allah, some rambling about ASIO. So I guess the question is, should we class this as a Islamic terror attack? And I have to say, in this particular case, based on the information I have, I'd have to say no. I don't think we should see it as a Islamic terror attack, despite the fact that this guy was rambling about Allah and the mistreatment of Muslims. And the reason why is because this guy is mentally ill. That's not just an excuse. He has a long history of mental illness. In fact, he had an appointment that day, which unfortunately he missed. Now, could you argue that Islam is a contributing factor? I would say yes, it is. Maybe that's the straw that broke the camel's back. That could be the one thing that he focused on that set him over the edge. But if it wasn't that particular thing, it was bound to be something else, because the main issue was his mental illness. And I suspect exactly the same thing can be said about Minassian. We have a mentally ill man who has a long history of mental illness and being rejected and picked on. People described him as strange and not fitting in. That's the reason why he did the attack in Toronto. Now, sure, maybe there was an incel blog somewhere which he read which sent him over the edge. I'm not suggesting that reading angry incel comments helped him, but chances are he would have done the attack anyway. If he had never heard of the incels, if he had never read a single paragraph about incels or from incels, he eventually would have done this anyway. If it wasn't incels, it would have been something else. Who knows, it might have even been Islam. So I think it's important to point out the difference between someone with a mental illness who latches onto something like incels or Islam, as opposed to, actual terrorists who do things because of their ideology. And by the way, I'm not excusing actual Islam terrorists who do this. There's been numerous van attacks or truck attacks by Muslims who aren't mentally ill. That excuse should not be made for them. They are doing it purely for ideological reasons. But I think there is a difference, and I think we should be honest and we should look at the circumstances of every single case and not just jump to the conclusion that this particular person has a connection to that particular group, therefore that must be the reason. But I mean, every generation does this to some degree or another. Back in the 80s, it was Dungeons and Dragons and heavy metal music. There was a moral panic about satanic cults tricking young kids into becoming Satan worshippers and holding rituals in sewers under cities and all kinds of crazy shit. Today it seems that the scapegoat is MRAs, if you're a left-winger, and Muslims if you're a right-winger. And like I said, I have no problem with people pointing out actual terrorism which is done for actual ideological reasons. But we need to be honest about every single case. We need to examine the circumstances in every single case and not just jump to conclusions which suit our ideological bias. So, just to finish off this video, I want to do a very quick thought experiment. I want to look at the Melbourne attack using the tactics used by feminist journalists when they're talking about MRAs or other groups that they dislike. So let me stress straight up, I'm only making this argument to illustrate a point. I don't actually believe it. In fact, the reason why I'm making this argument is to point out how fucking insane it is. So let me stress that so I'm not quote-mined or straw-manned, which unfortunately is all too common. Okay, so the very first thing we would do if we were to use feminist tactics to examine the Melbourne attack is we would either totally ignore the fact that this guy had mental health issues, or alternatively we would diminish and dismiss it. So we might mention it in passing, and then we would say something like, the mental health issue is just an excuse. So we would never look at it seriously, we would never have an actual serious discussion about it, or a serious examination. We would just ignore it, or dismiss it outright as being an excuse. So having done that, we would shift the focus to the couple of statements that he was reported saying. So he mentioned Allah, and he mentioned Muslims being persecuted. So therefore, this clearly is the only factor that should be concentrated on. This should become our entire focus. We should write article after article after article saying that this is the reason why this particular attack happened. That is the only thing that we can talk about. And then we would scour his social media pages, trying to find anything he's said or any time he's mentioned any aspect of Islam. Doesn't matter if it's radical or not, that's not the point. We will just conclude that all of Islam is radical. We will come to the conclusion that there are no moderate Muslims, that there is no moderate version of Islam, and that all Muslims everywhere are evil terrorists who want to climb in cars and run down people, and we will just present this as a fact. Now the next step is to connect Islam to feminism. Now we know that social justice advocates are constantly defending Islam. They're constantly referring to any criticism, even if it's fair, as Islamophobia. They come to the conclusion that any criticism, no matter how fair, is based on discrimination. And in fact, they see Muslims as a discriminated group, just as they see women as an oppressed, discriminated group. So based on this, we can use the overlap argument. We can say, well, there is a massive overlap between feminism and Muslims. In fact, there really isn't any difference. We can just swap the word Islam for the word feminism, and that should now become our main focus. So all the headlines everywhere should be feminist extremist runs down people in Flinders Street. And we should then write long articles explaining how feminism, not Islam, not mental illness, but feminism radicalized this guy and turned him into a monster, and that there is a constant danger. We have to stress the constant danger. There is a constant danger of online feminism radicalizing these people, and they could jump in their car at any minute. They could jump in their car at any minute and run down a member of your family. That's how dangerous feminism is. So you can see that using these methods, we shift from what is the most likely explanation of mental illness and just go right off the deep end and conclude that, well, clearly feminism is to blame. Now, obviously, this is fucking insane. The guy has never mentioned feminism, as far as I know. So coming to the conclusion that feminism somehow influenced him because there's some slight connection to Islam somehow, despite the fact that most feminists and most Muslims believe in dramatically different fucking things and have very, very different worldviews, concluding that this is somehow the blame of feminism is fucking insane. And it's incredibly dishonest. But that's what the media is constantly doing to MRAs, as you have seen right throughout this entire video.
To my knowledge, this bit of agitprop goes back in origin to Elliot Rodger's killing spree and was first manufactured by the Daily Kos, linked. Note with Kos, CNN, and Futrell, none offer a single shred of evidence proving the connection. Indeed, all the evidence available demonstrates a clear separation of these groups. Incels are no more an offshoot of the men's movement than the men's movement is an offshoot of feminism. Propagandists like Futrell know this, just as they know for certain that they're sending their readers on a wild goose chase in trying to understand why these tragedies happen. The victims of these killings, especially the women, are just bodies for people like Futrell to stand on while clouding the issues with disinformation. And since the fake news machine will continue to mislead the public about the growing body count, it is on the red pill community to look for answers to this that are intellectually honest. And since we don't have the resources of places like CNN, we are left to relying on our thinking caps and a little common sense. Well, the internet helps a lot too. Linked below, you'll find an article that I discovered after I had already started writing this talk. It has one of Alek Minassian's former classmates who had with him attended a special education class for students with autism. Let's see. Adam Lanza, Dylan Roof, Nicholas Cruz, Elliot Rodger, and Alek Minassian. All mass killers, all autistic, and I will bet you dollars to donuts that before all the information rises to the surface that we will find out that Minassian suffered some degree of father absence and had likely been bullied at some point. Thanks to hacks like Futrell and ideological news outlets like CNN, the general population won't find out about this. And for his part, David Futrell is doing everything he can to goad more abused, autistic young men into killing women so he can use it to further his narrative. It's not like it's him that will pay the price for it after all. Probably the only reason some incel would run Futrell down with a car would be because the incel was afraid of running out of gas trying to drive around him. But alas, I digress.